A clock rings only once, and someone dies moments later. Welcome to Fog Casebook. I am your host, Vela. Comment below and tell me where you're listening from. I truly enjoy seeing it. Now the mystery begins. In setting down these notes of Mr. Sherlock Holmes's singular career, I have more than once found myself at a loss whether to admire most his almost inhuman clarity of intellect or the curious delicacy of his perceptions, in which, like some finely tempered instrument, responded to the faintest vibration that passed unnoticed by coarser minds. It was upon a raw evening in late November, one of those London nights when the fog seems not so much to fall as to rise from the very cobbles, that the affair of the clock which rang once first came to our notice. Holmes had been languid the greater part of the day. The grey drizzle had kept even the most adventurous of our clients indoors, and the fire in Baker Street, for all Mrs. Hudson's attentions, gave forth only a meagre warmth. I had read the Times from end to end, and having exhausted even the advertisements, sat watching my friend's long, nervous fingers manipulate a length of string into some idle cat's cradle of his own invention. "You are restless, Watson," he remarked suddenly, without lifting his eyes. "I had thought myself remarkably still," said I. "A man may sit like a statue and yet be restless." Holmes's thin smile flickered.
"Ah, so your left boot is polished, your right boot is not. Your gaze has returned 7 times in the last minute to the corner of the mantelpiece. You are waiting for something." I stared at the mantelpiece in question. It held nothing more provocative than a small brass clock, an inoffensive object we had possessed these many months, its face plain, its hands punctual, its habit, like most clocks, to keep its counsel except for the sober tick which marks the passage of time. "Nonsense," said I. "I'm waiting for nothing." Holmes rose with that cat-like noiselessness which was so characteristic of him and stood before the clock. His profile was outlined against the window, where the street lamps made pale halos in the thickened air. "You are waiting," he repeated, "because you have already heard it." "Heard what?" He did not answer at once, but bent his head close to the brass case as though listening to a patient's breathing. For a moment his whole attitude changed.
But the languor vanished, and there came into his face that eager, hawk-like expression which always heralded work. "It rang once," said he quietly. I could not repress a laugh. "My dear Holmes, surely you cannot mean—" "Not here," he interrupted. "Not now. But you heard it, Watson. Once, a single chime, and then nothing." I was about to protest again when a sharp knock sounded at the door below, quick, peremptory, and urgent. Holmes's eyes flashed towards me. "Precisely," said he, "why we shall have our explanation." A moment later, Mrs. Hudson ushered in a man whose very entrance spoke of trouble. He was not of the common class of those who sought Holmes's assistance. His dress was plain, but of good cloth and careful cut. There was about him that restrained, almost fastidious propriety, which one associates with men accustomed to order, to punctuality, and to the weight of other people's expectations. Yet his face, long and pale, was drawn by anxiety, and his eyes had the feverish brightness of one who has slept little and thought too much. He removed his hat with a stiff politeness and stood as though uncertain whether to sit without permission. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said he. Holmes waved him to the chair. "You have the advantage of me," my friend returned. The visitor's gaze flicked to me, to the chemical apparatus upon our table, to the violin case in the corner, and finally rested upon the clock on the mantelpiece. And it was then that I saw the man's self-command falter. His lips parted slightly, and there came over his features a look which I can describe only as a startled recognition, like one who sees in a familiar object something suddenly monstrous. "You," he began, and then checked himself. "Forgive me, I am Nigel Hatherley." Holmes's brows rose. "Not the hydraulic engineer, I trust?" "No, no," said he quickly. "I was secretary to Mr. Lionel Carraway of Carraway House, Bloomsbury." Holmes's manner altered at the name. It was subtle, but I knew him too well not to observe it. He leaned forward a fraction. His fingers ceased their idle play. "Mr. Carraway of the Antiquarian Society," he murmured. "A collector of horological curiosities and early scientific instruments?" "Yes." Hatherley swallowed. He was... The man's composure broke. He pressed his hand briefly to his forehead, as though to steady his thoughts. "Mr. Holmes, and I've come because there has been a death." "A death seldom lacks company," Holmes observed. "What sort of death?" Hatherley's eyes darted once more to the brass clock. "A quiet one," said he in a voice that shook despite his effort. "Too quiet. A man does not die so neatly." Holmes's expression was unreadable. "Begin at the beginning, Mr. Hatherley." "It began," said the secretary, "with the chime." He spoke those words with such emphasis that I felt, absurd as it may sound, the hairs at the back of my neck stir. Outside, a cab rattled past in the fog, its wheels muffled. Within, the steady tick of our own clock seemed suddenly loud. "Mr. Carraway," continued Hatherley, "keeps a room on the upper floor which he calls his cabinet. It is locked always, save when he is within. He admits only myself and, on rare occasions, a gentleman from the society. In that room he keeps his most valuable pieces, watches from Geneva, marine chronometers, French mantel clocks."
And he hesitated. One particular clock. Holmes's eyes narrowed a shade. "Go on." "It was purchased only a fortnight ago," said Hatherley. "A tall case clock, oak, very dark, older than it looks. It came from an estate sale in Sussex. The dealer knew little of it, only that it had belonged to a certain Reverend Josiah Merton, who died in 1832. "Sussex," murmured Holmes, as if tasting the word. "At first," Hatherley went on, "it seemed ordinary enough. It was silent most of the time. Mr.
A Carraway was displeased, for he had bought it as much for its mechanism as for its history. He set it himself, examined it, cleaned it, and declared that its works were peculiarly ingenious, though he would not tell me why. 2 nights ago, at exactly 1 minute past midnight, it rang once. 1 minute past, repeated Holmes softly. Yes. Hatherley's fingers tightened upon the brim of his hat. Not 12, not 1, just 1 chime, and then silence. We heard it in the hallway below, and it was so unexpected that I started from my chair. Mr. Carraway, he paused, and I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Mr. Carraway went white as paper. What did he do? Asked Holmes. He laughed, said Hatherley in wonder. A short laugh, like a man who has been touched suddenly on the shoulder in the dark. Then he said, "It has begun." Holmes's gaze met mine for an instant, and in it I read a spark of that intense interest which only the unusual could kindle in him. "Oh, after that?" he prompted. "After that," Hatherley said, "he became different. He would sit for hours in the cabinet with the door locked. He sent away a guest he had invited. He refused to go to the society meeting. He asked me strange questions, whether I had spoken of the clock to anyone, whether I had ever heard the name Merton, whether I remembered a certain scandal of 30 years ago concerning a missing will. Hatherley shook his head. It was not like him, Mr. Carraway is a man of method, Mr. Holmes. He arranges his life as he arranges his collections, everything in its place. Holmes steepled his fingers. And last night? Hatherley drew a long, shuddering breath. Last night, at 1 minute past midnight, it rang once again. Holmes said nothing, but his stillness was of that peculiar sort which meant his mind was racing. I was in the hallway, Hatherley continued. I had come up to fetch papers from my desk. The house was quiet. On even the servants had retired. The clock chimed, one thin note. I remember thinking how lonely it sounded in that great house, like a bird calling once, and then being swallowed by the fog. I went to Mr. Carraway's door. He had asked not to be disturbed, but... I don't know why, Mr. Holmes. I felt compelled. Perhaps it was the chime itself. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. I tried the handle, locked. Then, from within, there came a sound like a chair scraping against the floor. Holmes leaned forward. Forced entry? I had no key, said Hatherley. The cabinet key is on Mr. Carraway's chain always. I ran down for the butler. He came with an axe from the scullery. He swallowed hard. We broke the door. And found. Hatherley's voice fell to a whisper. Mr. Carraway was seated at his desk, said he, as if he had simply paused in his work. His eyes were open, his mouth... He made a helpless gesture. Laddie, there was no wound, Mr. Holmes, no sign of struggle. Yet upon the desk before him lay a single object, a small envelope, sealed in black wax, and beside it... He stopped. The room seemed to contract around us. Beside it, Holmes repeated very gently. A key? Said Hatherley. Not the cabinet key, another, old-fashioned, iron, and in the corner of the room the tall clock stood with its pendulum perfectly still. Holmes rose so suddenly that I started. You brought the envelope? He demanded.
Hatherley's hand went mechanically to his coat. Yes, I did not open it. I thought, Mr. Holmes, I thought perhaps it was meant for you. He held it out. Holmes took it between finger and thumb as though it was some delicate specimen. There was, I observed, no name written upon it, only a single mark impressed into the black wax seal, a small circle containing the faint outline of a bell. Holmes's eyes glittered. And Scotland Yard? Said he. The police came, Hatherley answered.
Inspector Lestrade himself. He called it heart failure. He said Mr. Carraway was not young, and that excitement, collections... He spread his hands in despair. But, Mr. Holmes, a man does not clutch an iron key in death unless he has reason. And why should a clock ring once at 1 minute past midnight, twice, and then fall silent as a grave? Holmes turned the envelope over, sniffed it once, and smiled, a smile which in him was rarely a sign of amusement, but often of battle. Watson, said he, you will oblige me by putting on your boots. Mr. Hatherley, you have done perfectly in coming. We shall go at once to Carraway House. He paused a moment before the mantelpiece clock, and with a quick motion opened its brass case. His long fingers touched something within, something I could not see. And for an instant the ticking ceased. Then very softly a single chime sounded in our sitting room. Just one. Holmes shut the case with a snap. His eyes met mine again, and there was in them that rare, electric certainty which always meant he had scented the true trail. There, said he, our clock has spoken. Now let us hear what it has to say. The fog had thickened by the time we stepped out into Baker Street, wrapping the gas lamps in woolly halos and muting the sounds of the traffic to a distant, watery murmur. Holmes walked a pace ahead of us, his long coat buttoned high, and his head bent slightly forward in that absorbed attitude which told me that the world around him existed only as raw material for thought. Mr. Hatherley kept close at my side. In the clearer light of the street I could see how deeply shaken he was. His hands trembled despite his effort to keep them still, and more than once his eyes flicked nervously to Holmes's back, as though seeking reassurance in the very set of my friend's shoulders. "You see, Doctor, or Watson," he said in a low voice as we walked, "I knew Mr. Carroway for 11 years. He was not a man to die unprepared." Few remarks could have been more calculated to pique Holmes's interest. He stopped so abruptly that Hatherley nearly collided with him. "Prepared for what?" Holmes asked, without turning. "For something," the secretary replied helplessly. "That is what frightens me." Holmes nodded once, as if the answer satisfied him more than any elaboration could have done. We continued on our way, soon hailing a cab which bore us northward through streets that grew progressively quieter and more respectable as Bloomsbury drew near. The houses there rose in sober ranks, their brick facades stern and reserved, as though determined to keep their secrets well behind their drawn curtains. Carroway House stood back from the street behind a small iron gate. It was a tall, narrow building, severe in aspect, with only a single lamp burning above the front door. Holmes paid the cabman and stood for a moment surveying the place, his keen eyes travelling from the basement windows up to the roofline. "A man who lives alone," he observed, "yet employs servants enough to preserve appearances." "No light in the upper windows, Mr. Hatherley?" "None since last night," came the subdued reply. Inspector Lestrade ordered them extinguished. "Lestrade," Holmes murmured, as if noting an old adversary's footprint upon a familiar path. That the door was opened to us by the butler, a grave, grey-haired man who eyed Holmes with the faint curiosity of one accustomed to unusual visitors. Within, the house smelled faintly of polish and cold air. Our footsteps echoed upon the tiled floor of the hall, and I was struck by a curious sense of expectancy, as though the walls themselves were listening. Holmes wasted no time upon preliminaries. "The cabinet," said he. The butler hesitated, then bowed. "This way?" "Aye, sir." We ascended a narrow staircase, the banisters smooth with age. At the top, the passage turned sharply, ending in a stout oak door, which bore unmistakable signs of violence. The panels were splintered, and the lock hung twisted and broken. Holmes examined the damage closely. "An axe, you said," he remarked. "Yes, sir," said the butler. "I wielded it myself." "With reluctance," Holmes added quietly. The man started. "Indeed, sir." Holmes smiled faintly and pushed open the door, and the cabinet was larger than I had expected, running the full width of the house. The air within was close and carried a faint metallic tang, as though from old oil and brass. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with clocks and instruments of every description, some elegant, some austere, all bearing that peculiar dignity which comes of careful preservation. In the far corner stood the tall case clock Hatherley had described, its dark oak surface gleaming dully in the lamplight. At the centre of the room was a heavy desk, and behind it, seated as if still in command of his domain, was Lionel Carroway. Death had taken him gently, if death can ever be called gentle. His head rested against the high back of the chair, his hands lay upon the arms, one of them loosely clasping an iron key. His face bore no contortion of pain, only a curious expression of strained attentiveness, as though he had been listening intently at the very moment his heart had ceased to beat. Holmes approached him without hesitation. He stood for a long moment in silence, his gaze fixed upon the dead man's face. Then he bent, laid 2 fingers lightly upon Carraway's wrist, and finally examined the eyes with careful precision. "Not heart failure," he said at last. Hatherley gave a sharp intake of breath. Then, Holmes replied calmly, "we are dealing with something both more subtle and more deliberate." He turned to the desk, but the surface was orderly to the point of austerity. Papers neatly stacked, a pen laid squarely across an inkstand, and, in the very centre, the black sealed envelope. Holmes did not touch it. Instead, he surveyed the surroundings, his eyes darting from object to object with extraordinary speed. "You broke in," he said to Hatherley, after hearing a sound from within. "What sound, precisely?" "Like a chair," Hatherley answered, as if it had been pushed back. Holmes glanced at the floor. At the chair stood square to the desk, its legs evenly placed upon the rug. Yet it was not moved far, Holmes observed. Perhaps not at all. He straightened and crossed to the tall clock. Its presence dominated the room. Though silent now, there was something about it which drew the eye irresistibly. Holmes opened the glass panel and peered within at the pendulum and weights. "Has it been touched since last night?" he asked. "No one has gone near it," said Hatherley quickly. But Holmes nodded and closed the panel. He stepped back, studying the case from several angles, and then did something which surprised me greatly. He placed his ear against the wood. "Listen, Watson," he said. I did so, but heard nothing beyond the faint echo of my own pulse. Holmes straightened. "Exactly." He returned to the desk and at last picked up the envelope. He examined the seal once more, then broke it cleanly and withdrew a single folded sheet of paper. His eyes scanned it rapidly, and for a fleeting instant I saw a look pass over his face which I can only describe as grim satisfaction. He handed the paper to me without comment. It was written in a firm, precise hand. "The debt is acknowledged. The signal has been given. When the bell rings once, the time has come." There was no signature. "A confession?" I ventured. "A reminder," said Holmes, "and a remarkably arrogant one." He took the iron key from Carraway's hand and weighed it thoughtfully. "This key," he continued, has not been used recently. See the rust undisturbed within the wards. Yet Mr. Carraway clutched it at the moment of death. That tells us something very important about his state of mind." "That he feared what it opened?" I suggested. "That he believed," Holmes corrected gently, "that it might still be opened." He replaced the key upon the desk with deliberate care. "Now then," he went on, "we have a man who acquires a clock linked to a long-dead clergyman. It reacts with terror to its first chime, withdraws from society, and dies immediately after the second. The clock, meanwhile, is found silent and untouched." He looked about the room once more, his eyes lingering on the shelves, the instruments, the locked drawers. "The clue," said he softly, "is not in what has happened, but in what has not." At that moment there came a sound from below. Footsteps upon the stair, brisk and familiar. A second later, Inspector Lestrade appeared in the doorway, his expression one of mingled relief and annoyance. "So it's you, Holmes," said he. "I might have known." Holmes inclined his head politely. "You have been very thorough, I trust?" Lestrade snorted. "As thorough as one can be when there's nothing to find. No poison, no wound, no sign of foul play. Old man dies at his desk. Happens every day." "Does it?" said Holmes mildly. "At 1 minute past midnight, to the sound of a single chime, from a clock which does not keep the hour?" Lestrade frowned. "Why, that clock again. I've had it looked at." "And found it innocent?" Holmes finished. For the moment. He turned away, already losing interest in the inspector. "Come, Watson," said he, "we have seen enough here. Mr. Hatherley, I should like you to remain available. Inspector, you may keep your heart failure for now." As we left the cabinet, I glanced back once more at Lionel Carroway, seated amid his silent collection. The tall clock loomed beside him, inscrutable and still. Behind us, and unseen and unheard, time continued its relentless march. But somewhere, I felt certain, a mechanism had been set in motion which would not rest until it rang again. We had not gone far from Carroway House when Holmes slackened his pace and drew me aside beneath the shelter of a bare plane tree. The fog pressed close about us, and the house loomed dimly behind, its dark windows like unseeing eyes. "Watson," said he, "Lestrade's presence was useful, although not in the way he imagines." "You mean his certainty?" I asked. "His complacency," Holmes corrected. "It tells me precisely how much time we have before official curiosity stirs again, and where it will not be directed." He resumed walking, this time at a slower, more reflective pace. Mr. Hatherley followed a step behind, silent now, as though afraid that speech might shatter whatever fragile order still remained to him. "Let us review," Holmes continued, what is speaking more to himself than to us. "Mr. Carroway purchases a clock of obscure provenance. Upon hearing its first chime, he exhibits fear, not surprise. He anticipates something. He speaks of a beginning. That tells us the clock is not the cause, but the signal." "A signal to whom?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, that is the question which will earn us our supper." We had reached the corner when Holmes stopped once more, his attention caught by something on the pavement. He bent. I peered briefly at the ground and straightened. "Interesting," he murmured. "What is it?" said Hatherley eagerly. "A scuffed heel mark," Holmes replied. "Fresh, narrow, turned sharply here and headed east. Someone left the house in haste last night, and not by the front door." "There is a side passage," Hatherley said, "used for deliveries." Holmes nodded, and conveniently overlooked. We proceeded to the passage, which ran between Carroway House and its neighbour, a half choked with refuse bins and swallowed by shadow. Holmes examined the ground with care, tracing the faint impressions with the tip of his cane. "Only one set of prints," he said, "and lighter than Mr. Carroway's. Our visitor was not burdened, except perhaps by knowledge." "You think someone was there when he died?" Hatherley whispered. "I think," Holmes replied, "that someone ensured he would die alone." We returned to the street, and Holmes hailed another cab. "All right, to the British Museum," said he crisply. Hatherley looked astonished. "At this hour?" "The past," Holmes answered, settling back into the seat, "keeps longer hours than we do." During the drive, Holmes fell into silence, his eyes half closed, his fingers drumming softly upon his knee in an irregular rhythm. I have learned, through long experience, that this is the posture he adopts when fitting together pieces which do not yet declare their pattern. Mr. Hatherley, for his part, sat rigid, staring fixedly ahead. At the museum, Holmes produced a card which procured us admission without delay. We were conducted through echoing corridors to a quiet reading room, where the smell of old paper hung heavy in the air. Holmes moved with certainty to a particular shelf and withdrew a thick volume bound in worn leather. "Transactions of the Sussex Ecclesiastical Society," he read aloud, 1831. He opened it, turning pages with swift precision. "Ah," said he at last. "Here we are." He slid the book across to me. The passage he indicated concerned a Reverend Josiah Merton, vicar of a small parish near Lewes. There was mention of a dispute over a charitable trust, vague accusations of impropriety, and, most striking of all, a sudden withdrawal from public life shortly before the Reverend's death. No charges were ever proven, I read aloud, but several documents relevant to the case were reported missing. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Or missing documents have a habit of resurfacing, Watson, particularly when men believe time itself is on their side. Carraway believed Merton had left something behind, I said slowly. Something hidden. Something counted, Holmes replied. Merton was a scholar of mechanics before he took holy orders. He wrote a monograph on escapements and time delay mechanisms, quite unorthodox for a country clergyman. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. Imagine a man, he continued, who conceals a truth so dangerous that he entrusts it not to people nor to institutions, but to a machine, a device which does nothing until a certain condition is met. A clock, Hatherley breathed. A clock, Holmes agreed, which rings once, not to mark time, but to announce it. We left the museum near dawn. The fog had thinned, and a pale light crept into the streets. Holmes walked with renewed energy, his fatigue seemingly forgotten. "There is one thing we have yet to examine," he said. "Why, the iron key." "That was not the cabinet key," I reminded him. "Precisely. And yet Mr. Carraway grasped it at the end. That tells us he believed it to be relevant, urgently so." We returned to Baker Street. Holmes unlocked the small drawer in his desk where he kept certain reference items and withdrew a collection of keys of various ages and designs. He compared the iron key carefully against them, noting its length, its wards, the peculiar notch near its bow. "Prison," he said abruptly.
"Or prison?" I echoed. "Not a modern one," Holmes clarified. "A private lock, the sort used for strong boxes, concealed compartments, or," he paused, "for clocks." He glanced up at me. "Watson, you recall that Carraway's tall clock came from Sussex?" "Yes." "And that it was taller than its case required?" I frowned. I did notice the proportions were odd. "Because," Holmes said quietly, "it is not merely a clock." He crossed to the mantelpiece and stood once more before our own brass timepiece.
"2 nights," he continued. 2 chimes, each one a warning or an invitation. Carraway received the first and prepared. The second he did not survive. "You think the clock killed him?" I asked. Holmes's smile was thin. "No machine kills without assistance, but a machine may convince a man that death is inevitable." He turned suddenly to Hatherley. "Did Mr. Carraway ever speak to you of a date?" he demanded. "A deadline? An anniversary?" Hatherley's face drained of colour.
"He did," he said hoarsely. He said that on the third night everything would be finished." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Then," said he, "we have 1 night remaining." He checked his watch. "Gentlemen," he continued briskly, "we are dealing with a design that has been decades in the making. The clock has rung twice. If it rings a third time, it will not be for Mr. Carraway." "For whom then?" I asked. Holmes reached for his coat. "For the man who believes," said he,
"that time has finally absolved him." Outside, the city stirred awake, unaware that somewhere within its labyrinth of streets a bell waited patiently to ring once more. Holmes slept little that morning, if at all. I know this because I, who am by no means a light sleeper, was awakened more than once by the soft creak of the floorboards and the faint clink of metal as he moved about our rooms. When at last I rose, the November light was already filtering weakly through the curtains. And Holmes sat at the table with a magnifying lens in one hand and the iron key in the other. He looked up as I entered, his eyes bright and wholly unwearied. "Good morning, Watson," said he. "You will forgive my discourtesy in not waiting for you. Time in this matter is peculiarly literal." "You have discovered something?" I asked. "Confirmed something," he replied, "which is always more dangerous." He held the key up to the light. This was made by hand, not cast. Late 18th century.
Perhaps a trifle later. The notch here, he indicated it with the tip of his lens, is a maker's signature of sorts. I have seen it before. Where? In a place devoted to forgotten mechanisms, Holmes answered, which is where we must go next. He rang for Mrs. Hudson and gave instructions with unusual brevity. Within minutes, we were once more in the street, Hatherley having been summoned from his lodgings nearby to accompany us. The secretary looked worse than ever, his eyes shadowed.
His movements stiff with fatigue and dread. "Mr. Holmes," he said as we walked, "if there is to be another chime—" "There will be," Holmes interrupted calmly. "The question is who will hear it, and under what circumstances." We made our way eastward, into a part of the city less polished and more densely packed. The buildings grew older, their brickwork blackened, their windows crowded close together. At length, Holmes stopped before a narrow shop front whose faded sign bore the words Thompson and Ryle, mathematical and mechanical instruments. The bell above the door gave a thin jangle as we entered. The interior was cluttered to the point of chaos. Shelves bowed under the weight of brass compasses, astrolabes, clock parts, and devices whose purpose was wholly obscure. From behind a counter rose an elderly man with a stooped back and keen, watery eyes. "Mr. Holmes," said he without surprise. "I wondered how long it would take." Holmes smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Ryle. I trust your memory is as reliable as your springs." "Better," said Ryle dryly. "Springs wear out, regrets do not." Holmes laid the iron key upon the counter. Ryle examined it, and I saw his fingers still. "Yes," he said at last, "that would be Merton's work." "You knew him?" I asked. "Knew of him," Ryle corrected. "He came to me once, many years ago, asked questions no clergyman should ask."
And paid in cash to avoid leaving his name behind. "About clocks?" said Hatherley. "About delays," Ryle replied. "About certainty. About how to make a thing wait." Holmes leaned forward. "And did you help him?" Ryle met his gaze steadily. "I sold him parts. No crime in that. What he built with them was his affair." "What did he build?" I asked. "A chamber," said Ryle slowly. "Inside a clock. Not for gears, but for papers."
And a trigger that would only release it after a fixed number of operations." "Chimes," Holmes murmured. Ryle nodded. "One chime per year, if set correctly. The third would open the chamber." Hatherley swayed slightly. "Then Carraway—" "Reset it," Holmes finished. "He altered the interval. Instead of years, he made it days. Why?" "Because he was afraid," said Ryle. "Afraid that whatever Merton hid would outlive him." "And the key?" Holmes asked. Ryle sighed. "A safeguard. If the mechanism failed, the key could open the chamber manually, but it had to be done at the exact moment the trigger engaged, or it would jam permanently." Holmes straightened. "And if a man believed," he said softly, "that he had missed that moment—" Ryle looked at him gravely. "Then he might believe he was too late." We left the shop in silence. The implications pressed heavily upon us all. Carraway believed the third chime would expose something, Hatherley said. Something terrible. And that someone else feared that exposure even more, Holmes replied. "Who?" I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he led us back toward Bloomsbury, his pace measured, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Watson," he said at last, "consider the letter. The debt is acknowledged. A debt implies two parties. The signal has been given. That implies agreement. When the bell rings once, the time has come." "For what?" I pressed. "For reckoning," Holmes said. Why Merton's scandal was hushed, not resolved. A trust was misappropriated. Funds vanished. Someone benefited. Someone else waited. "And Carroway?" said Hatherley. "Was the custodian," Holmes replied. "Not the criminal, but the accountant of a crime." We reached Carroway House once more as dusk settled over the city. Holmes dismissed the servants and instructed Hatherley to remain below. "You will hear a chime tonight," Holmes said quietly. "When you do, do nothing. I'll leave everything to me." He and I ascended to the cabinet alone. The tall clock loomed as before, silent and inscrutable. Holmes examined it carefully, opening panels, peering into its depths. At last he straightened, his face composed. "The chamber is there," he said, indicating a section behind the pendulum, "and it will open when the clock rings." "And the third chime?" I asked. Holmes glanced at his watch. "In less than an hour." The room grew oppressively still. Outside, the fog thickened once more, pressing against the windows. Holmes extinguished the lamps until only a single, shaded light remained, casting long shadows across the walls. "Watson," he said quietly, "someone will come tonight. They cannot resist. Whatever is hidden in that clock threatens them still." "And if they do not come?" I asked. Holmes smiled, a thin, anticipatory smile. "Then," said he, "I shall ring the bell myself." We took our positions, the silence stretching, or the seconds marking their inexorable march. Somewhere deep within the clock I fancied I heard a faint, anticipatory click, as though time itself were drawing breath, preparing at last to speak. The minutes crept forward with an almost palpable weight. Holmes stood near the tall clock, his figure half lost in shadow, while I took a seat behind the desk where Carroway had died. The faint tick of the mechanism sounded unnaturally loud in the hush, each beat like the measured fall of a hammer. Holmes consulted his watch and raised a finger, bidding me listen. From below came the distant murmur of the house settling, a soft cough from somewhere in the servants' quarters, and then nothing. The silence deepened until it pressed upon my ears. At precisely 1 minute past midnight, the clock stirred. There was a brief internal click, sharp and decisive, followed by a single chime. It was thinner than I had expected, almost delicate, yet it cut through the room with uncanny clarity. The sound seemed to linger long after it had faded, as though the walls themselves retained its echo. Holmes did not move. His gaze was fixed upon the clock's case. For several seconds nothing happened. Then, with a faint metallic sigh, a narrow panel at the rear of the clock slid open by the width of a finger. Holmes stepped forward instantly and slipped his hand inside. I heard the soft rustle of paper. He withdrew a slim bundle of documents tied with faded ribbon and replaced the panel before stepping back into the shadows once more. "Quickly," he whispered. "Someone is already on the stairs." I strained my ears and caught it then, the cautious creak of a footstep below, followed by another. The sound was careful, practiced, betraying a man accustomed to moving through houses not his own. The door handle turned slowly. It paused, then turned again with firmer pressure. The door opened. A man entered the cabinet, carrying a shaded lantern. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed with meticulous care, though his coat bore the faint sheen of long use. His hair was greying at the temples, his face lined not by age alone, but by years of guarded calculation. He advanced a few steps and stopped short at the sight of the clock. "So," he said quietly, "it has rung." Holmes stepped into the light. "Yes, Sir Julian," said he, "and you have come right on time." The man stiffened, but recovered himself with remarkable speed. "Holmes," he replied coolly, "I might have known Carraway would have arranged for theatrics even in death." "Carraway arranged for nothing," Holmes returned. "He merely reset the mechanism. The theatrics are entirely your own." Sir Julian Ashcombe's eyes flicked to the desk, to the shadows beyond, and finally back to Holmes. "You have nothing," he said. Whatever foolishness Merton devised died with him." Holmes smiled faintly and held up the bundle of papers. "On the contrary," he said, "it waited." Ashcombe took an involuntary step forward. "Those documents," he said sharply, "are meaningless old accusations. No court would—" "Fail to take an interest in the ledgers of a charitable trust," Holmes interrupted, "especially when matched against bank records, land deeds, and the rather convenient elevation of a certain junior trustee some 40 years ago." Ashcombe's lantern trembled. "You killed Carraway," I said, unable to restrain myself. Ashcombe turned on me, his expression hardening. "I frightened him," he snapped. "That is all. The man was already half mad with his clocks and secrets. I told him the third chime would ruin us both. He chose to believe me." Holmes inclined his head. "And in doing so, Anna, you confirmed his worst fear, that the truth would surface regardless." Ashcombe laughed shortly. "Truth is a matter of timing, Mr. Holmes, and I was certain I had time." Holmes's eyes glinted. "Time," he said softly, "is the one thing you miscalculated." Ashcombe lunged. It was not a wild charge, but a swift, desperate movement toward the clock. Holmes anticipated it. He stepped aside, extending his cane in a sharp, a precise motion that caught Ashcombe's wrist and sent the lantern crashing to the floor. It guttered once and went out, plunging the room into darkness. There was a brief, violent struggle, boots scraping, breath hissing, then a heavy thud and a groan. When I struck a match and relit the lamp, Ashcombe lay sprawled upon the rug, Holmes kneeling upon his chest, one hand pinning the man's arm behind his back. "Watson," said Holmes calmly, "if you would be so kind as to ring for Inspector Lestrade." Lestrade arrived in due course, bristling with indignation, which gradually gave way to reluctant admiration as Holmes laid out the chain of events. The document spoke plainly enough. Merton's trust, the misappropriated funds, Ashcombe's rise, and Carraway's role as the man who discovered the truth too late to act openly, yet not too late to ensure it would one day emerge. He frightened Carraway into believing the clock itself would kill him, Holmes concluded. A suggestion, a chime, and a mind already strained by secrecy did the rest. Lestrade shook his head slowly. "All this," he muttered, "for a bell that rang once." Holmes smiled faintly. Once was enough. Ashcombe was taken away, silent now, his confidence finally spent. As dawn crept once more into the cabinet, T. Holmes replaced the papers upon the desk and closed the clock's hidden chamber for the last time. Outside, the city stirred as it had the day before, unaware of how narrowly one man's past had escaped burial beneath the patience of a machine. Later, as we walked back through Baker Street, I remarked upon the elegance of the design. "A clock that waits decades to speak," I said. "It seems almost merciful." Holmes shrugged lightly. "Mercy, Watson,
Is merely justice with good timing." He glanced up at the pale morning sky and quickened his step. "Come," said he, I find myself in need of breakfast and a clock that does nothing more sinister than tell the hour. The matter might have ended there, with Sir Julian Ashcombe committed to the slow reckoning of the courts, and the tall clock reduced to a mere curiosity stripped of its darker purpose. Yet, as I have often observed, Holmes was never content merely to see justice enacted.
What he required also that understanding be complete. It was for this reason that on the evening following Ashcombe's arrest, he returned once more to the subject as we sat together in our Baker Street rooms. The fire burned cheerfully, and the familiar brass clock upon the mantel ticked with comforting regularity, its honest industry in marked contrast to the malignant ingenuity of its taller cousin. "You see, Watson," said Holmes, leaning back with his fingers steepled, the case was never about murder in the ordinary sense. Carraway died because he believed he was already condemned. Ashcombe merely supplied the final pressure. "By reminding him of the third chime," I said. "By promising it," Holmes corrected. "Fear, when applied with precision, can be as lethal as any poison. Carraway knew what lay hidden in that clock. He knew what it meant for Ashcombe and for himself as the man who had chosen silence too long. When the second chime sounded, Almy told him only that time had resumed its march. "And the third," I said, "was the moment he could no longer endure." Holmes nodded. "Exactly. Had Ashcombe stayed away, Carraway might have survived the night, but Ashcombe could not resist. Guilt, like truth, grows impatient." I reflected for a moment upon the long years during which the clock had stood silent, waiting for the alignment of circumstance and conscience. "Merton designed it as a kind of moral machine," I said. "A delayed confession." "A confession with teeth," Holmes replied. "He trusted time more than men, and in that he was not entirely wrong." The following day, at Holmes's request, the tall clock was dismantled under careful supervision. The hidden chamber was removed, its clever mechanism rendered harmless. The documents were conveyed to the proper authorities, and the remainder of Carraway's collection was bequeathed to the society he had once served so diligently. As for Mr. Hatherley, he came to see us before leaving London. He looked a different man, still grave but steadied, as one who has at last been released from a burden he did not know he carried. "I thought myself merely a secretary," he said quietly. "Yet I was guarding a truth all the while." Holmes regarded him with an expression of unusual kindness. "We are all custodians of something," said he. "Most of us simply never learn what it is." When Hatherley had gone, I turned once more to my friend. "Did you downplay your role?" I said. "Without you, the clock would have claimed another victim, or buried its secret forever." Holmes waved the compliment aside. "I merely listened when it rang." He rose and stood before the mantelpiece, opening the brass case and adjusting the hands with habitual care. The mechanism resumed its steady tick. "Time," he continued thoughtfully, "is the most patient of accomplices and the most relentless of judges. Men imagine they master it because they divide it into hours and minutes. In truth, it masters us by waiting." He closed the case and turned back to me, his familiar ironic smile returning at last. "Come, Watson," said he, "let us leave delayed revelations to clocks and clergymen. I have no doubt London will contrive a more immediate puzzle before long." As he spoke, the clock on the mantel chimed the hour, clear, honest, and complete. Not once, but fully, as a clock should. And for the first time since the affair had begun, the sound brought with it no sense of dread at all. Only the quiet assurance that, for now at least, time had been set right again.